Beep, 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 beep. Hello. I'm sporting the yellow again. I'm doing the whole, I'm a space hopper. Da, 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 da. How we doing, peeps? All right, okay. Oh my gosh. I found something good, so I'm going to share it with you. What the hell? Become a warrior teacher, buy me a coffee, Substack, but subscribe. If you can buy me a coffee, I'd be really grateful. Just become a warrior teacher. It's easier. Okay, so here goes. I think that we learn best from what is good and thoughtful analysis, whichever ideological framework or ideological corner you come from on that thoughtful analysis. If it's thoughtful analysis that has a resonance, then it's something worth reading because we can understand people's point of views. Warrior teachers are, that's what you do. You have a you that is a warrior teacher, and you've got to look at the entire landscape. So it's always interesting to come across something that gives a perspective that others may not perhaps taken on board. So I'm very pleased to read today. I did say on Twitter to the person involved, I'm mulling. That's all I said a few days ago. So I've done my mulling. I've decided I'm going to read you this one because I think not only is it worth hearing, I think it's also important factually and puts to bed some of the nonsense that the gender ideologues and the queer theorists will rattle on about, people that are a third gender and the cultural significance of historical third genders in, Indigenous, whatever it may be. So, the bollocks they talk when they mix all three, gender, queer and critical race, colonialism, right, and all that cobblers. They're the most colonising thing in history. It's just so surreal. We'll deal with colonialism. How are you going to do that? We're going to colonise everything. So, I would draw your attention to the website, which is a website called On the Woman Question, a critical approach to Marx and feminism. Right. So this is it's a particular mindset which is written from that particular perspective by various people, and I think this is worthwhile taking a look at. I've also got the original tweet that I tweeted about it. So I'll put all this in the doobry so you can have a look, right? And the title of it is called Third Gender Categories, Homosexuality and Transgender Identity. Again, bear in mind, critical Marxist feminist view we're having here. Okay, we're hearing here. The capitalist mode of production requires a continual growing workforce in order to meet the production demands of a constantly expanding market. This, in turn, requires continued and widespread heterosexual reproduction in order that capitalist states continue to profit from overpopulation, right? Now, whoever wrote this, right, you and I, over a large gin and tonic, would have profound disagreements, okay, about that very idea, okay? So I'm not with you on that at all. Right, that's okay. It's great. Let's put it out there. Let's people have the conversation, which I think is exactly what you're doing here. Beyond the active workforce, the capitalist mode of production also requires overpopulation in order to maintain a reserve army of labour. The reserve army of labour, a term coined by Engels and later expanded upon by Marx, refers to the capitalist interest in maintaining an unemployed population, whose purpose is twofold. Firstly, the reserve army of labour can be conscripted to meet growing production demands, and secondly, it can be used to drive down the cost of labour through competition for employment when not actively required for production, right? Now, this is, very interesting, right? So, it's very interesting in a number of ways. First being, it's not wrong, right? But it's ideological, okay? So I don't disagree with any of that. I don't, right? But it's coming from a particular viewpoint, which is the point that I'm making today, from a feminist Marxist lens. Big industry, as Marx explained, constantly requires a reserve army of unemployed workers for times of overproduction. The main purpose of the bourgeois is to have the commodity labour as cheaply as possible, which is only possible when the supply of this commodity is as large as possible in relation to the demand for it, i.e., when the overpopulation is the greatest. Overpopulation is therefore in the interest of the bourgeois. Well, Marx published that in 1847. I think technology might have burst that bubble a bit. But I'm willing to be argued against it, It's a fascinating view, I just think it's out of time, right? And I think we're now beginning to confuse capitalism, which is what you and I are doing right now, okay? Or what we do when we buy something from the corner shop to support the local business. That's capitalism. And what corporatism. That's what I think we're doing, right? Okay, it's confusing the two, but that's just me. Then we've got adoption and surrogacy notwithstanding. Heterosexual relationships are the only form of sexual relationships to produce viable offspring. Therefore, historically, heterosexuality has been legally enforced or otherwise socially encouraged in economies concerned with increasing production, or just with still being around, possibly, right? Okay? Conversely, homosexuality has been repressed by state apparatus through legislation, policing, prejudice, and discrimination. Modern capitalism, however, has developed much more efficient means with which to manipulate the size of the workforce, predominantly migration. It could be argued that migration replacing sexual reproduction as the primary method of population control has resulted in a softening of legislative homophobia, at least in the West. Interesting, isn't it? Throughout history, the ostracization of homosexuals has been so extreme that many societies have fabricated separate social classes to other gay men and lesbians and gender non-conforming people. Of course, acknowledging the existence of homosexuality would shatter the illusion that the heterosexual pairing family is the only possible familial structure. Well, I don't think we're even vaguely close to being like that anymore. So that this is an oppositional view, isn't it? We're seeing here to the view of 2.2. Yep, the oppositional view coming through in this excellently written piece. Similarly, right, acceptance of gender non-conforming individuals casts doubt on the socially constructed notion that men and women's personality traits fall neatly into the sex stereotypes designed to ensure men and women fulfill their productive and reproductive potential. Men as workers and women as birth givers, caregivers, and domestic servants. If these ideas were allowed to flourish, society may, over time, shift away from the capitalist ideal of a codependent, monogamous, heterosexual pairing family, and thus individuals may no longer compliantly partake in reproductive labour. Rather than risk this undesirable eventuality, various society and states created social categories to literally, and sometimes physically, remove gay and gender non-conforming people from normal society. Now here's where it gets really juicy and really interesting, and what's fascinating about this article is that there is we know this because they've got other third genders that I mentioned at the beginning, right? It's all bloody waffle, right? So, but what's being said here is that it is the capitalist system of production that drove the necessity for a third gender. Not buying it. Not buying it. Right? Because they were around long before the capitalism was. Is this a rail against corporatism? I don't know. But let's move on, because it is very fascinating to read. Once removed from general society, again here talking about gay and gender non-conforming people, and categorised as non-men and non-women, these individuals no longer pose a threat to the heterosexual status quo, and so their treatment has varied from society to society, sometimes reverent, sometimes discriminatory. Very interesting there, that dichotomy between reverent and discriminatory. Very interesting, yes? Because what they're saying is there that sometimes it was done out of a sort of compassionate or even reverent, and then on the other times it was done for dreadful reasons. Well, that's true. But what we've got there in that one sentence is the two bookends, haven't we? Sometimes it's discriminatory and sometimes it's reverent. Somewhere in the middle, I think we'll find the truth. In almost every instance of third sex categories, which are now used as evidence of the widespread historic existence of transgenderism, these social classifications are largely a means of othering homosexuals or otherwise enforcing heterosexuality. This is very good, isn't it? At providing us with the entire, if you will, bookcase by giving us two bookends there. The reification and the absolute condemnation of homosexuality and the othering of others who would homosexuality and gender non-conforming. India, for example, here is a global example, notorious for its caste system, is home to one such third sex category, the Hijra. We've heard this before. Serena Nanda notes in the Hijras of India cultural and individual dimensions of the institutionalized third gender role, that Hijras in contemporary India extensively engage in sexual relations with men. Nanda clarifies that this is not a new phenomenon, saying that eunuch transvestites in Hindu classic literature also had the reputation of engaging in homosexual activity. Here, the link between India's third sex category and male homosexuality is evident. Another third gender category, which is frequently referenced in the ongoing gender identity debate, is Native American Two-Spirit people. Needless to say, due to the many different tribes within Native American culture, this is a far more complex issue that is currently being presented. Deirdre Bell explores this issue in depth in her article, and there's a link there for you in that article, toward an end to appropriation of indigenous two-spirit people in trans politics, the relationship between third gender roles and patriarchy. Again, the feminist Marxist lens, remember? That's the lens we're looking at today. Bell says it's very strange to watch the contemporary trans movement attempt to incorporate American Indian cultural conceptions of gender nonconformity because it's so clearly an attempt to shoehorn people of the past into contemporary cultural labels. She adds that in some third gender societies, two-spirit was simply a way to handle homosexuality within the group. Homosexual men were not considered fully men, a halfway gender that wasn't quite normal. There's somebody said the other day, and I don't know whether the author will, I'll put the author's name in the doobries and all that stuff. I don't know whether the author of this will know this, but they said that it was invented in 1990s in Canada and then it was invented somewhere else in America. Well, it was in the film Little Big Man in the 70s. They had a two-spirit character and he was obviously a fag, like me. Ooh. All men are faggotry. Right, so, yeah. And we then continue. In others, this behaviour of a third gender, of the othering of homosexuals. In others, it was a way to handle intersexed, literally, I'm using the word literally, not saying that that's a thing, people in societies with rigid sex binaries. In still others, it was for men who specifically preferred women's work and roles like weaving and cooking. Been with us a long time, peeps. She notes that far from being a measure of progress, the prevalence of two-spirit identity actually correlated with rigidity of gender roles. This is a Marxist feminist, right, lens, okay? Talk about it's all confusing. It's all confusing, isn't it, folks? That actually this idea of a third gender, the two-spirit identity, is actually correlated with the rigidity of gender roles within a tribe, and notes that more egalitarian societies with less gender socialization had an absence of two-spirit people due to their lack of emphasis on sex-assigned gender roles. So what they're saying is, what's being said here, I believe, is that the idea of gender being playing with, it's all about the enforcement of gender. So true when we look and see the shenanigans of the trans rights activists and queer theorists and the LGBTQI hands, knees and bumps of daisy people. So fascinating to see that what's being said here really aligns with what I'm saying, which is the whole thing's about enforcing gender. It's not about doing anything else with it. Right. So, in essence, the emphasis was on the fact that we wanted strict gender roles, so we invented a third to deal with Barry. That's the reality of it, right? And Oman, who's the writer, also recognises a third gender. Oman, also, which is a place, Oman, also recognises a third gender known as Xanith, Xanith, which refers to effeminate males who are submissive in homosexual relationships. Bottoms, then. Right, okay. Again, it appears that this third gender category is synonymous with homosexuality. What's going on here, I say? What's going on then? Oh gosh, it's almost like it was all about being gay in the first place. This demonstrates that socially conservative societies opt to other homosexuality rather than tolerate it. This is so astute. Samoan culture is often lauded as progressive for its cultural acceptance of the Farafine, the social category of effeminate males. In Global Forces and Local Life Worlds, Social Transformations, Shurkin says Farafine are identified at an early age by virtue of their propensity for feminine tasks, meaning domestic labour. This is about gendering, yeah? And so this concept is wholly dependent upon the sex stereotypes that Marxists seek to abolish. And there's the dichotomy, there's the rub, isn't it? How can we say that this is a kind of cultural Marxism and at the same time recognise that Marx said, let's get rid of these gendered roles because it doesn't do any good for anybody? How do we square that circle? It's an interesting one, isn't it? An interesting one. Okay. Far from progressive, however, which is what they're making it out to be. Oh, look at Samoa. Right? Samoa still outlaws gay marriage. So if Farafine are to marry, it must be to a woman. Culturally, Farafine are accepted as a source of domestic labour, but importantly, are still expected to partake in heterosexual reproduction. Interesting. Fascinating. Fascinating analysis here. In Iran, homosexuality is punishable by death. The Iranian government lifted religious restrictions on so-called sex reassignment surgery and encourages homosexuals to undergo corrective transition. I believe they pay for it, actually. As an addition there. I think they'll actually pay for it, Many gay Iranians choose to undergo sex reassignment surgery in order to avoid persecution or execution for homosexuality. In this way, gay men have three choices: remain in the closet indefinitely, become straight women via forced transition, or die. All of these choices effectively remove homosexuality from Iranian society. The Iranian state's acceptance of transsexualism is not progressive. It is extreme homophobia, enacted through forced sex reassignment surgery. Closer to home, Alan Turing is a notable individual example of corrective transition. Turing was a homosexual English mathematician who famously cracked the Enigma code, allowing British intelligence to decipher German communications during World War II. When authorities were alerted to Turing's homosexuality, he was offered a choice of 2 years imprisonment or 2 years of chemical castration through hormone replacement therapy. Knowing that his Enigma machine had the potential to end the war much earlier and save millions of lives, he opted for hormone replacement therapy and freedom to continue his work on the project. In polite British society, where homosexuality was considered a perversion, corrective transition through HRT was used to maintain heterosexual social order. True, right? That's true. However, the reasons it was illegal, I think, are worth examining if you're going to look at this in more depth, because it wasn't a great, huge societal swath that wanted to criminalise homosexuality. It was a certain few people. Interesting. In 1862, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, a homosexual German thinker and writer, outlined a theory of a third sex to categorise homosexual men as anima muliebris virilae corpore inclusa, meaning a female psyche confined in a male body. That's from 1862. The idea of Cartesian dualism there, the two. Interestingly, what was once used to medicalise and excuse homosexuality is now used as part of a celebratory gender identity narrative. In 1918, Earl Lind, also known as Rolf Werther and Jenny June, published the autobiography of an androgyne, a memoir about coming to identify as a third sex. The book describes the author's life, his sexual encounters with both men and women, and his decision to undergo castration. Both Ulrichs and Lind's work demonstrates internalised homophobia and a strong desire to explain, excuse, or apologise for their homosexuality. That's what's going on, folks. Human nature doesn't change. One of the few third gender categories which apply to women is the Bernesha, or the Bernesha, meaning he/she, of Albania. These women take oaths of celibacy and live as men in order to gain certain rights and privileges reserved exclusively for men. For example, after the death of a head of a household and in the absence of male heirs, a woman would become a Bernesha to secure her family's property and honour. The existence of this third gender category is testament to the lack of legal and societal sex equality. Women must use the Bernesha loophole and forgo sexual activity reproduction in order to claim basic property rights. Rather than a progressive acceptance of gender nonconformity, this third gender category is demonstrative of age-old patriarchal dominance. Readers will note that the vast majority of these third sex categories apply to effeminate or gay males, but not to masculine or lesbian women. Though all homosexuality is obstructive to the population expanding aims of capitalism, female homosexuality is more objectionable due to the high reproductive value of female sexual organs. Whilst male testes perform the equivalent role of female ovaries, both produce and release the sex cell of their respective sex, sperm cells in males, egg cells in females, the female uterus is uniquely invaluable in its ability to gestate fertilized egg cells. For this reason, lesbianism is considered to deprive heterosexual society of a valuable womb, and so historically lesbianism has hardly been acknowledged, let alone accepted or accommodated. Again, I find myself in disagreement. One of the main reasons that lesbianism has been tolerated is because it turns straight men on. But hey, what do I know? Whilst third gender categories have historically been created to accommodate gay men, no such categories have been created which would allow lesbians to exist outside of heterosexual society, thus forcing lesbians into unhappy heterosexual relationships to ensure that no womb is wasted. Every variation of socially constructed gender throughout history, including masculinity and femininity, has existed to enforce the nuclear reproductive family and to other those who do not conform in or partake in it, particularly homosexuals. The root of all incarnations of gender is deeply misogynistic and homophobic and is intrinsically tied to sexual reproduction. Societies have consistently created separate social categories and stereotypes for men, women and homosexuals in order to maintain continued sexual reproduction, which in turn maintains the size of the productive population. Now, that was written in April 2021, and I think it's a fascinating piece, and I wonder whether there'll be a follow-up to it, because it provides us with an insight into this idea of a third gender, or the wonderfulness of the third gender, and debunks to a great degree, in the same way I've heard from others, that this is in fact anything but the enforcement of strict and rigid gender roles. However, in doing that, it also, I'm afraid, in my mind, exposes the power and oppression narratives at work in a Marxist sense and a feminist sense there. But also that's the same power and oppression narratives that the victimhood movements we are seeing today are using. So we must be careful, I think. Yes, fascinating, right in many ways. From an ideological perspective, it's written for feminist Marxist thought, right? Which is why I think it's profoundly wrong in many ways. But that is a conversation over a large gin and tonic. Go well. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope that proves thought-provoking for you. See you later.